I was standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the kettle to boil, when my son said very calmly, "This is where you get off." It wasn't said in anger. There was no raised voice. He said it the same way he might have announced a turn or a stop sign. I remember noticing how steady his hands were on the steering wheel and how quiet the road felt at that moment. I didn't respond right away. I just looked ahead at a stretch of gravel and bare trees and thought about a document folded carefully in my purse that I hadn't looked at in years. That came later. At the time, my life was still what it had always been. I'm 68 years old. For nearly 50 years, I was a wife, a mother, and the steady center of Hazelbrook Orchards, a small organic apple farm in rural Pennsylvania. My hands are slower now, stiff with arthritis, but they still remember the work, mixing dough for sourdough bread before sunrise, holding pruning shears in the early cold, walking row by row with my husband, Richard, while the fog lifted off the hills. 3 weeks before that drive, I buried him. Richard and I had been married since 1981. We built the orchard together, tree by tree, loan by loan, season by season. He died of pancreatic cancer after 14 months of quiet decline. He didn't want our children to know how bad it was. I remember him saying it one night, his voice low and thick from the medication, asking me to let them live their lives a little longer without worrying. I agreed, because that's what we had always done for each other. We carried weight quietly. By the time the diagnosis came, our children were already distant. Darren had built a fast, polished life in Boston's financial world. He came home rarely, always briefly, always checking his phone. Samantha moved from one wellness venture to another, each one needing just a little more money to get off the ground. Richard helped when he could. I stayed out of it. That was our rhythm. I thought the funeral might change something. I thought grief might slow them down. They arrived dressed well, said the right things, hugged me carefully, but even then I felt something was off. They looked around the house the way people do when they're assessing repairs, measuring, not remembering. The night after the funeral, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The wood was worn smooth from decades of meals. I told them we could go through Richard's things together the next day. It felt like the right thing to offer. The next morning, sunlight came through the lace curtains we'd chosen 30 years earlier. I made coffee the way Richard liked it, simple and familiar. I sat and waited. They came down dressed as if for a meeting, Darren in a blazer, Samantha perfectly put together. They didn't sit right away. Darren placed his mug down carefully and said, "Mom, we've been talking." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I watched steam rise from my cup and waited for the kettle to click off on the stove. That's where I'll pause. They said it was about practicality. Darren spoke first, leaning slightly forward, his mug untouched. He said the orchard was too much for me now. The house was too big. He said it the way people do when they believe they're being reasonable. Samantha nodded along, adding that there were nice retirement communities not too far away, activities, people my age. She smiled when she said it, the way she used to when she wanted something to sound gentle. I didn't answer right away. I stood up and began clearing the breakfast plates, moving slowly, letting the clink of ceramic fill the space. My hands were shaking a little, but not from fear, from something settling. Darren slid a folder across the table. He said Dad had talked to him last year, that there were documents, plans. He said Richard wanted him and Samantha to take over. He said it was all handled. I looked at the papers without touching them. They were printed on Darren's corporate letterhead. Richard's signature sat at the bottom, neat and even. Too neat. I knew his handwriting. I'd watched it change over the months. This wasn't it. I said it wasn't from our family lawyer. Darren said Richard had been lucid. Samantha said it quickly, like she was helping him finish a sentence. Then she mentioned a developer, $7 million, a clean sale, everyone taken care of. I sat back down. I remember noticing a crack in the corner of the table where Richard once dropped a crate. I traced it with my finger while they talked. They were already past me. They were speaking about timelines. I asked to see the will. Darren hesitated. Then he pushed the folder closer. I didn't open it. I said I was tired and wanted to rest. I said we could talk tomorrow. They agreed too easily. That night I didn't sleep. The house made its usual sounds, pipes settling, wind moving through the orchard. I lay still and stared at the ceiling, counting nothing in particular. By morning I had made a decision, even if I hadn't put words to it yet. When I came downstairs, they were ready to leave, coats on, a suitcase by the door. Not mine. Samantha said they'd packed essentials for me. Just to look at a place, she said. No pressure. Darren checked his watch while she spoke. I poured myself coffee. I said I wasn't going to a retirement community. Darren said the paperwork was done. He said I couldn't stay. He said it was time to let go. I asked to get my medication and some photos. Upstairs, I moved slowly. I took what I needed, and then I took what mattered. Behind the old panel in the medicine cabinet, I retrieved my passport and birth certificate. From the back of the closet, behind Richard's flannels, I pulled out a small fireproof box. It was heavier than it looked. I closed the door quietly. When I came back down, Darren asked if I was ready. I said yes. I put my purse on my lap and waited as we drove past the orchard, past town, past the familiar turn that would have taken us toward Sunnyvale. Instead, Darren took a different road. The car slowed near an empty field. Gravel crunched under the tires. He pulled over and stopped. Then he said it. "This is where you get off." I opened the door without speaking. The wind was cool. The road was quiet. They drove away. I stood there for a moment, holding the suitcase they'd packed, listening to the sound fade. Then I adjusted my grip, stepped onto the shoulder, and began to walk. I didn't walk toward the gas station Darren mentioned. I waited until the dust settled, until the road was quiet again, and then I turned the other way, toward town, toward Hazelbrook. My shoes weren't made for gravel, and I could feel the stones through the soles, but the rhythm of walking steadied me. Step, breath, step. I put the phone face down in my purse and didn't check it. The morning was already warming. I loosened my coat and kept going. After a while, the road softened into pavement. I passed fields just beginning to green, fence posts leaning the way they always had. Nothing looked different, and that helped. It reminded me that not everything changes just because people do. I reached Miller's Gas and Grocery a little before noon. My feet were sore. I sat on the bench out front and set the suitcase beside me. I didn't open it. I just sat and watched cars pull in, watched people come and go. Then I waited. Ray Miller came out wiping his hands on his apron. He'd known me for decades. He looked at my face longer than usual and asked if I was all right. I said I was just resting. He glanced at the suitcase but didn't ask questions. He never had. Inside, he let me use the phone. I dialed Harold Jennings from memory, our lawyer. He answered on the first ring and sounded surprised. He said there'd been a will reading scheduled. He said Darren had already come by. He said he had concerns. I told him I needed help and discretion. He said to come to his office. Before I left the store, I bought a prepaid phone and a bottle of water. Ray waved off my money. I thanked him and meant it. Harold's office was across from the library, up one narrow flight of stairs. His secretary ushered me in without questions. Harold didn't sit behind his desk. He chose the chairs by the window. That told me enough. I told him everything, slowly, in order. I didn't skip anything. When I finished, I opened my purse and took out the fireproof box. Inside was the original deed to 20 acres of land, purchased in my maiden name years before Richard and I married. Land with water rights, land essential to the orchard's future. Harold held the paper carefully. He didn't smile. He didn't rush. He said the will Darren presented didn't match the one on file. He said the signature was wrong. He said this deed changed everything. I listened. He laid it out simply. Step 1, freeze the sale. Step 2, notify the developer of incomplete land rights. Step 3, challenge the will formally. No emotion, just process. I agreed. He made the calls while I sat quietly and watched people pass in the street below. Couples, parents, a man walking his dog. I folded my hands and waited. By the next afternoon, the sale was frozen. A courier delivered notice to the developer. Lawyers began calling Harold, not me. That was important. I let him handle it. That evening, my phone lit up. Samantha's name. I didn't answer. I put the phone face down and waited. Darren called next. He didn't leave a message. The orchard was still standing. The paperwork was moving. Nothing else needed my attention yet. I went back to the bench outside the bakery and sat there until the sun lowered. When I stood up, my joints protested, but my mind was clear. The next step would come soon enough. I didn't go back to the farmhouse. That was a decision I made quietly, without discussion. Harold had suggested it might be better to stay somewhere neutral for a while, and I agreed. Not because I was afraid, but because clarity needs space. I rented a small apartment above the bakery on Main Street. It had 1 bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a balcony just wide enough for a chair. In the mornings, the air smelled like bread and cinnamon. That helped more than I expected. I unpacked slowly. I lined my medication up on the counter. I folded my clothes into the dresser drawers. I placed the fireproof box on the top shelf of the closet, behind a stack of towels. Then I sat down and waited. The calls continued, but they didn't come to me. Harold handled them. He told me the developer had been blindsided. They hadn't been told about the separate water rights. They were nervous. Nervous people make mistakes, and careful people wait. So I waited. 2 days passed, then 3. On the 4th morning, Harold called. He said the developer was formally withdrawing, too much risk, too many unknowns. He said the emergency injunction had been granted, and the forged will was officially under review. He said the court would want time. I said I understood. Later that day, I walked to the library. I sat at a long table and watched dust move in the sunlight. I returned a book I'd borrowed weeks earlier and hadn't finished. The librarian asked how I was doing. I said I was managing. That evening, Samantha texted again. This time there were more words. She said they hadn't meant for things to go that way. She said Darren was under a lot of pressure. She asked if we could talk and fix this. I didn't respond. Silence, when chosen carefully, does its own work. The next week, Harold invited me back to his office. He laid out documents in neat stacks. He explained what would happen next and what wouldn't. The orchard business, as structured, couldn't move forward without my consent. The land in my name wasn't negotiable. The trust Richard and I had set up years ago, quietly and properly, was intact. Nothing dramatic, just facts. I signed what needed signing. I initialed where Harold indicated. I asked one question about timing. He answered it. Then we were done. Outside, Hazelbrook moved at its usual pace. Someone was sweeping a storefront. A delivery truck idled. I stood there a moment before walking back toward the bakery. That night I made tea and sat on the balcony. I listened to the sounds of town settling down. I thought about the orchard without going there. I thought about Richard without reaching for grief. I thought about my children without calling them names. The situation wasn't finished, but it was contained. That mattered. The next step wouldn't require my voice, it would require patience. So I put the phone face down, then I waited. Harold asked me to come in the following Tuesday. He didn't say why on the phone. He didn't need to. His tone was enough. Calm, direct, already organized. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting area with my hands folded in my lap. Helen offered water. I declined. I watched the clock instead. Then I waited. Darren and Samantha arrived together. I heard them before I saw them. Darren's voice was low but sharp, cutting through the hallway. Samantha was quieter. When they stepped into the office, Darren stopped short. He hadn't expected me to be there. Samantha's face shifted, just slightly, then settled. Harold didn't invite us to sit right away. He closed the door, adjusted a folder on his desk, and then nodded toward the chairs. We sat. I chose the one by the window again. It helped to look outside. No one raised their voice. Harold spoke first. He explained the status of the will. He explained the injunction. He explained the water rights and the land held separately in my name. He spoke slowly, using plain language. There was no accusation in his voice, just sequence, just record. Darren interrupted once. Harold lifted a hand and kept going. When it was my turn, I didn't explain how I felt. I didn't describe the road or the gravel or the suitcase. I didn't need to. I stated what was true, that I had not signed away my home, that I had not agreed to leave, that the orchard could not be sold without my consent. Samantha looked down at her hands. Darren stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves. Harold slid one document forward. It was the original trust paperwork, dates, signatures, witnesses, everything in order. He explained that the business would remain frozen until the court ruled. He explained that any further action without authorization would carry consequences. No one argued. There was a long pause, a quiet one. I noticed the hum of the old radiator. I noticed the dust on the windowsill. Then I waited. Darren finally spoke. He said they'd made assumptions. He said they thought they were helping. His voice was controlled but tight. I didn't respond to that. I responded to what mattered. I said I would not be returning to the farmhouse for now. I said all communication would go through Harold. I said the orchard would continue under the existing structure. I said I expected distance. Harold wrote that down. Samantha nodded. Darren didn't. The meeting ended without a handshake. That was fine. Outside, I stood on the steps and let the air settle around me. I didn't feel relief. I felt order. There's a difference. I walked back toward Main Street at my usual pace. I stopped at the bakery and bought a loaf of bread. I carried it upstairs and set it on the counter. I made tea. I sat by the window. The situation was no longer unstable. That was enough for now. The orchard stayed quiet that spring. I didn't go out there, not at first. I let the trees do what they had always done without me watching. I kept my days small and regular. Morning tea, a short walk, the bakery opening downstairs. I wiped the counter each night before bed and left the dishes to dry. Order returned one habit at a time. Harold called when something needed my signature. I came in, signed, and left. No conversations longer than necessary. The forged will was formally challenged and suspended. The developer withdrew completely. No announcements, no headlines, just paperwork moving through the right hands. I transferred the water rights into a local agricultural trust we'd helped form years earlier. Young farmers would use it. They would maintain it. It would stay what it was meant to be. Harold said it was clean and permanent. That mattered. I began teaching again at the community center on Wednesday nights, quilting at first, then small workshops on soil care and sustainable orchards. People came quietly. They stayed. They listened. I didn't speak loudly. I didn't need to. My hands still knew what they were doing. Darren and Samantha kept their distance. There were a few messages early on, short ones, careful ones, I didn't respond. Boundaries work best when they're consistent. Harold handled anything legal. I handled my life. One afternoon I walked past Hazelbrook Orchards. The gate was closed. The trees were in bloom. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching petals fall into the grass. I didn't go in. Not yet. I would, eventually, on my terms. That evening I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and listened to the town settle for the night. A delivery truck passing, someone laughing on the sidewalk below, the smell of bread still warm from the ovens downstairs. I thought about the woman who stood on that gravel road with a suitcase she didn't pack. I didn't feel anger toward her. I felt respect. She didn't panic. She didn't beg. She walked. A few weeks later, a woman from the library asked if I'd help her friend review some land paperwork, just to look at it. I said yes. Quiet help, offered carefully, has a way of traveling. My life is steady now. My name is still on the deed. The orchard still stands. And my days belong to me again. If this story felt familiar, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps keep this space going. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I read more of those than you might think. 2 popular stories will appear next, and I'll see you there when you're ready.